Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our virtual theater for the presentation, Treasures Off the Page, the Yiddish Book Center's type collection. Before we get started, a few things to note. Your video and your audio will be off throughout the program. You may send us questions via the question panel. We ask that you keep them short and please refrain from comments so that we can get to all the questions this evening. It's a pleasure to introduce this evening's colleague and presenter, Caleb Sher. Caleb is the Yiddish Book Center's Richard S. Herman Endowed Senior Fellow. He holds an interdisciplinary humanities degree from University of King's College, Halifax, as well as an MA with a certificate in Jewish Studies from the Center for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto, where he received a social sciences and humanities research scholarship. Following his MA, Caleb began a degree in information studies, but left his program to pursue work in the Yiddish realm. Beyond his interest in and rapidly growing collection of Yiddish books, the material anchors of Yiddish literary and cultural history, Caleb gets excited about public humanities, open access to knowledge, and in his own words, good memes, especially in Yiddish. And if I may add, all of us at the Yiddish Book Center are so excited about the work that Caleb has been doing with our Yiddish type collection. So welcome, Caleb.
Thank you, Lisa, for that kind introduction. And hello, everybody out there. I'm very excited to share our type collection with you today. So I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen here. All right. So let's get started then. So as I was sitting down to write up my notes for this talk today, I found myself looking for a guidepost to everything I have learned in my efforts this past year working with the Yiddish Book Center's type collection. Being still at my heart a literature scholar, I hit the books and found a gem of a passage in the introduction to the 50th anniversary Jubilee volume of the International Typographical Union Local 83, otherwise known as the Hebrew American Typographical Union. I'm going to read this first in Yiddish, and then I'll read it in translation. The passage goes, Die Aufgabe, als ein Buch herauszugeben, ist gewinn sehr schwer. Es hat poshet gefällt der Material für ein Werk. Eder man hat sich gekannt nehmen für der Arbeit, hat man früher gemusst sammeln sich Reines, sich nicht in dem eigenen Sekoren. The task of getting this book published was quite hard. The necessary materials were simply lacking. Before we could get to work, we had first to collect memories, to rummage in our own memory. Now, I'm sure I could give a whole drosha about how the image of collecting memory and rummaging through memory describes our day-to-day work at the Yiddish Book Center, but I'll spare you all. Safe to say that in beginning to document and understand the Book Center's collection of Yiddish type, I did literally have to go rummaging through memories, but more on that later. I'll split my presentation today into two sections. First, I'll detail what I have been able to find out about what we've got here at the center, including where possible information on the provenance of our collection, and then I'm going to spend some time talking about the role that type plays in our public-facing interpretation of Yiddish history and culture through our new permanent exhibition, Yiddish, A Global Culture. But first, what is all this type doing at the Book Center anyhow? We aren't a print shop, nor are we strictly a library or an archive. Well, I hope that I'll show today why and how our collection of type informs the museum's narrative beyond just being the material with which one produces the written Yiddish word. For those who have yet to have an opportunity to visit the center, I should mention that we recently opened, as you may know, an ambitious new permanent exhibition in our Amherst, Massachusetts building, an attempt to retell the story of Yiddish from a global and contemporary perspective, highlighting especially the stories that were often left behind in favor of the great men of Yiddish literature, including, as we'll see today, a bit about the story of the very labor of typesetting and the laborers who did it. Let's get to the point. Practically speaking, among our many other hats, we in the bibliography and collections team here at the Yiddish Book Center manage a physical collection of over 150,000 objects, mostly books that call the center their home. Among these items is, of course, our collection of Yiddish metal and wood type, as well as the last remaining linotype from the once bustling composing room of the Yiddish daily paper, the Forverts. Old newspaper photo plates, over 45 Yiddish and Hebrew typewriters, and other ephemera related to the production of the word. Now, for those in the audience who don't know their fonts from their sorts, I'm going to give a brief Type 101 lesson. Most of the Book Center's collection takes the form of letterpress type, that is, individual letters and characters called sorts, which a typesetter has to set one by hand, and then align and lock things up before running it through a printing press to produce a printed page. These sorts can be big or small and made of wood or metal. Most of our collection is metal type, and most of it is what we call display type, that is, larger point sizes, which one would use for setting things like headlines, chapter titles, and the like. We do have some smaller type, and it would be used for setting the body of a text, but most of the sources from which we received our type would have set the bodies of their text with more mechanical means, like a linotype, which we'll talk about a bit later. We do have a good amount of wood type as well, including some very, very large letters, which would have been used for printing posters. We have, as you can see, several cabinets, each of which contains several cases or drawers, which house an individual font, a font being a given typeface at a particular size and weight. So for example, size 12 Times New Roman bold. Now, many of our cases are incomplete, and we also have several cases with assorted typefaces in them. But we'll see all this in a minute in a bit more detail. First, a word on the difference between Hebrew and Yiddish type, because as you should know, Hebrew and Yiddish use the same alphabet, but they of course use them differently. One of the ways you can really tell the difference between type that was purpose-built for setting Hebrew works compared to type that was purpose-built for setting Yiddish works is through the diacritic marks. So in Yiddish, we use the diacritic marks a little bit more sparingly than in Hebrew, and really the only diacritic marks that are absolutely essential are some of the marks that go under the letter Aleph, as you can see in the top corner here, the pasich, the straight line, and the kometz, the little t, which respectively make the A and O sounds, the A and O vowel sounds. So those are pretty important sounds, and you'll need to be able to have a letter that can produce it. In Hebrew, you'll sometimes find type that has no diacritics whatsoever, and you'll sometimes find type that has lots of decorative diacritics, depending on whether it would have been used for setting Hebrew with the diacritic marks or without them. And that you can see an example of at the bottom here. So without further ado, let me take you through our collection as best I can. There are two main sources of type in our collection, a donation in the mid-1990s from James Kaplan of Baltimore, Maryland, and one from the Jewish Daily Forward, or the Forverts in Yiddish. The first big chunk in our collection, and without a doubt the most complete, is the type that came to us from James Kaplan. Kaplan was a self-taught Yiddish speaker, later the first ever graduate of the University of Wisconsin's extension program in Yiddish language. Having picked up typesetting later in life, he founded a hobby press which he called the Ethnic Press, specializing in printing non-English materials, including Yiddish. To the best of my knowledge, and according to all of the sources that I've been able to find, Kaplan's notes, articles published in our own magazine Packenträger, and the mind and memories of Aaron Lansky, the founder and president of the Yiddish Book Center, all of the type which Kaplan gave to us came to him from the widow of Dr. Henry or Chaim Einspruch, who was a Yiddish-speaking immigrant to Baltimore, who converted to Christianity and spent the rest of his life as a missionary to other Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants. Dr. Einspruch was, in addition to being a missionary, a translator. He viewed all of the existing translations of the New Testament into Yiddish as subpar, mostly having been prepared by born Christian missionaries with an inadequate grasp of the language. Einspruch, despite his conversion, maintained a deep-seated love for the Yiddish language, and so set out to translate anew the New Testament, inspired by the accomplished literary translation of the Torah done by the poet Yehoash. Einspruch called his own translation of the New Testament the Bris Chadoshe, and for what it's worth, no less a critic of Yiddish literature than the great Melech Ravitch praised Dr. Einspruch's work, saying, "The Einspruch translation of the New Testament is unquestionably beautiful. One feels that the translator is familiar with modern Yiddish literature and that he is a master of the finest nuances of the language." So what does any of this have to do with type? Well, predictably, when Einspruch brought his manuscript around to local Yiddish print shops, the story goes that they all refused the job, being unwilling to partake in the conversion of fellow Jews. Forced into a corner, Einspruch taught himself how to set type and acquired a set of type with which to produce his new Yiddish Testament. Flash forward a few decades, and when Kaplan donated the type to us, with the blessing of Einspruch's widow, from whom he had received the type after the new head of Dr. Einspruch's missionary foundation wanted to scrap it, that type had barely been used. Einspruch only printed his book once, and the rest of the run was done by a technique called offset. The Einspruch type made its way to us in November of 1994 and has been with us ever since. But let's look at a little bit of this type. So what we're looking at here and what we're going to look at over the next couple of slides are what we call type specimens. These are printed documents that show what a typeface looks like when it's actually printed on a page. And what's neat about these is that these were all prepared by Jim Kaplan using the Einspruch type specifically for us at the Yiddish Book Center when he, on the occasion of his donation of the type to us. So this you can see here. This is the Peninim typeface, which is arguably the most common Yiddish and Hebrew typeface out there. Open up just about any Yiddish or Hebrew book from a certain era, and odds are it'll be set in this typeface here. And you can see we've gotten various sizes, with including all of Kaplan's helpful remarks, including notes about where we would find it, whether things are complete or not, all sorts of things like that. Moving on, we've got another typeface, another fairly common typeface from the Vilna family of typefaces. But on Kaplan's cases, when they came to us, they were labeled simply standard. This was apparently the standard font. But Kaplan rechristened these typefaces for us, calling this one Sammler. For those who know, Sammler is, of course, the word meaning collector in Yiddish, and it's the word that we at the Book Center use to talk about our network of volunteers who help collect Yiddish books for us. So here we can see a little bit more of the Sammler typeface, this in a bold and condensed font. And actually what's neat about this is that if you look in the corner there, you'll see a screenshot from a digitized book. That book is Dr. Einspruch's translation of the New Testament. This is the first page of the Gospel according to Matthew. And you can actually see that the drop cap chapter title Aleph there is the very Aleph that would have printed this type specimen that we received from James Kaplan. And moving on further, things get a little bit more fun now. This is the typeface called Modern in Kaplan's case notation and was rechristened by him for us as Pakenträger. Pakenträger, of course, being the name of the Book Center's magazine. This typeface is originally called Village or Velish. My Polish is not great, my apologies. It was first cast in a foundry in Warsaw in the 1930s and later became an incredibly popular typeface, especially for setting the titles of books and headlines in newspapers, as you can see in the corner there. A little bit more of the Pakenträger. Again, this is a sort of condensed or thin version, and some more examples of it in use in actual printed Yiddish books. What's neat about this is you can see it was used across the globe, both ever from New York, even to Soviet Moscow as well, would have been using a typeface like this. Another one of my favorites. This is a very modern looking typeface, and we only have it in a very small point size called Miriam, but was called Cursive by Mr. Kaplan and was rechristened in honor of Aaron Lansky as Lansky Light, is the new official name of this typeface now. A few more of Kaplan's specimens here, these with Rosh Hashanah greetings, a gut gesund yor, a good healthy year, Lashona toiva tikosevu. And what's neat about this, you can see there's two different typefaces on this one, including one called Bomberg, after Daniel Bomberg, the famed Hebrew printer from 16th century Italy. Unfortunately, I don't believe that typeface ever actually made it to our collection. I think Kaplan kept it for himself, but you can see there's a note on the bottom of this specimen page here where he offered to basically print anything that we would have wanted printed in that typeface for us, which was very kind of him. But unfortunately, we don't have access to this type anymore. Moving on then, as I mentioned, roughly the other half of our collection comes, we believe, from the composing room of the Forverts, or the Jewish Daily Forward, including two cabinets with various levels of completeness, as well as a fairly substantial and varied amount of wooden display type. I want to note that I've yet to be able to find any hard proof that this type did in fact come from the Forwards, but there is written attestation in back issues of Pakenträger of a donation of several cases of type from them in or around 1992. And I'll say that 30 plus years ago, the Book Center was a bit more of a grassroots operation, and our focus was more on the physical act of recovering books and other material, and perhaps a little bit less on accurate record keeping. But here I'm also going off the memory of Aaron Lansky and what he recalls about a trip down to New York City to take the type directly from the Forwards headquarters on 33rd Street. The way he told the story to me, he actually got into a car accident on the way down, but he was so keen to save these materials that he kept going. Anyways, to be clear, I have absolutely no reason to doubt Aaron's memory of this event. But unfortunately, per Chana Polak, the Forwards archivist, the paper was similarly loose in those days with their record keeping, and so also doesn't have a record of ever having given us the type. Nevertheless, I think no reason to doubt that this type does in fact come from the Forwards. One of the things you can see on the page here is an actual poster that would have hung in the Forwards composing room using some of their own type to tell people that smoking was forbidden. And also you'll see an archival image here of the longtime editor of the Forwards, Simon Weber, ignoring that rule and smoking a cigarette as one of his typesetters smokes a cigar there along with him. So going through some of the Forwards type, I'll also say one further piece of evidence that this type does in fact come from the Forwards is that many of these cases have the remnants of a label demonstrating the typeface on them with the text Freund Weber es vet, and then they normally cut off after that point, which is a reference, I'm fairly certain, to Mr. Weber, as we met before, the longtime editor of the Forwards. And Aaron Lansky recalls that back in the day, these labels, when complete, were often complaints from disgruntled typesetters about Weber and his editorial leadership. Alas, without the second half of the phrases, I can't confirm this at the time. But a little bit more about the Forwards type, you'll see here some typefaces we may have already seen, some familiar ones like the Welisch or the Packenträger typeface up in the corner. These mostly in larger display sizes. Probably the Forwards was using these to set headlines in their newspaper. Some more interesting stuff. These are what we call shaded type. They have sort of lines or crosshatches marked into the surface of the type, and basically it was an ink saving method. It would have used a little bit less ink to print with these. And what you can see in the bottom here, this is actually screenshots from a digitized version of the Forwards in-house type specimen book. So this is the book that the Forwards would have had in-house with all of their type and a sample of all of their type that they could have used for their own reference when they were setting type. And you can see here some of the prints from these actual blocks of type that we now have in our collection, which is pretty exciting. Some more stuff from the Forwards. These are very, very small body text sorts, mostly in a sort of script. So instead of the block format of printed Hebrew letters, they are script or, imitating handwritten Hebrew letters. A lot of these were made by the great Jerusalem-based foundry Otiot Yerushalayim, and would have been useful for sort of mimicking a handwritten letter or something of the sort. And here are some of my favorites. These are assorted display type that come to us in our collection, we think, from the Forwards. Some pretty unique letter forms here that I haven't encountered anywhere else. Including in the top corner, you'll see what we call a halftone piece of type, so it could have used for printing two colors. I'm not sure that we actually have the ability to print with it anymore, which is unfortunate. And some other pretty unique typefaces that are, very few of these form a complete set of type. Very few even form a complete Aleph base anymore, but still they are very unique and very interesting, and I would love to be able to do a little bit more with them there. This one, a little bit more complete. I've yet to be able to identify what this typeface is, but it's a very unique, decorative, curly typeface, and I'll say we do have a complete Aleph base, and we even have a pretty complete set of this type in a fairly large display size. Moving on to some of my favorites in the next couple of slides. These are two probably would have been used as drop caps or for decorative purposes, florally decorated typefaces. The one at the top, you can see the floral decoration at the bottom. This, in my notes, as I was sort of preparing for this talk, I've been calling it the socialist floral typeface. And the reason being, you can see if you squint, all sorts of little symbols and words set into the letters and the negative space between the letters. You've got the clenched fist on another one of them, not shown here. There's a sort of two hands shaking. There's a rising sun. There's the word macht, or power, within the mem. In the base, the word broederlichkeit, or brotherliness, is set into the letter there. So all symbols and words that have to do with the Yiddish socialist movement back in the day. This next slide here, this was a type specimen that was printed using type at the Yiddish Book Center by the letterpress artist Jacob Rom. And apologies, there is a typo on the slide there. His name is Rom, not Room. Jacob, when he was working with our type about a year ago, kindly printed for us a type specimen using some of our more decorative typefaces. And it's actually when he printed this that he originally discovered all these symbols hidden within the letters of these floral typefaces at the bottom. And he's the one who alerted us to it. So thank you to Jacob for that. Another one of my favorites, a few decorative letters, almost a complete Aleph base, and letters sort of inset into a symbol in the background there. And if you look closely, you'll see it's a image of a globe surrounded by a chain with the letters AR in it, stand for Arbeiterring, or Workers' Circle. So this is actually the logo of the Workers' Circle as a set of type. I don't know what they use these for. I imagine maybe for, letterhead or something like that, maybe on mail-out campaigns or something, but they are pretty incredible, these ones. Moving on to some of our wood type, as I couldn't get through this presentation without talking about it. We've got a lot of wood type and a lot of very varied and pretty unique letter forms in our collection as well. One of my favorite is the mem up in the corner there. A lot of these are very, very large too, so would have been used for printing posters and like things like that. This one of my favorites, Meraba type, this is called. This was actually identified by Shani Avni, a great scholar of Hebrew type, working at the Rochester Institute of Technology. She visited us about 2 years ago and did some work with our Hebrew type. And one of the things that Shani told me in a later conversation with her is that a problem that Hebrew, especially Hebrew typesetters, often had is that sometimes they would need a diacritic mark, a little dot in the middle of the letter, and sometimes they wouldn't need it. In Yiddish, we call it a pintel. In Hebrew, I believe it's called a dagesh. And so one common practice that Hebrew typesetters would do is that they would take a flat top nail and they would drive it into the middle of the piece of type when they needed to print with the diacritic mark, and they would take it out when they needed to print without it, in order that they didn't have to keep basically two sets of every letter. As you can imagine, repeatedly driving a nail into and out of a piece of type is pretty damaging for the type. So Shani had always wondered why it is that no one had ever come up with a little system of dowels to easily remove and insert from a piece of type when you needed or didn't need the diacritic mark. And she had never found this in practice until she came and worked with our collection here at the Book Center. And you can see it actually with this hay at the bottom. There is a hole drilled in where you can fit a dowel if you need the pintle, and you can take it out if you don't need it. So it's pretty cool. These, some of the biggest type in our collection, is probably about 8 to 10 inches tall. Definitely would have been used for printing a poster, and you can actually see where they were cut down to size to fit more closely with each other. So these would have been used probably in a set to print a specific poster. Standalone, these spell the word tep, meaning cup. I don't know if this was part of a larger word and we're missing the rest of the letters, or if this was a poster advertising someone's cup-making business, perhaps. Some more of the ephemera from our collection. This is the Korten lexicon, or the card lexicon, a sort of trading card series with facts, biographical facts about Yiddish writers. On the flip side of these cards, you would actually see the photo of the writer and some facts from their life, but this is the front of the card, and we have a whole set of these blocks that would have been used for printing the fronts of these cards, a whole box full of them, which is pretty exciting. And the last piece I'll show you today from the collection is this, which says Ratvit die Bicher, or Save the Books. I imagine this was cast for us here at the Yiddish Book Center. I don't know what it was used for. I've yet to be able to find anything with it printed. It's pretty big. It's like wider than a standard piece of paper, wider than 8.5 inches. So I don't think it would have been used for a mail out campaign or anything like that, but I'm still searching for what it is that this originally was used to print. So to shift gears a little bit, the story of the material history of Yiddish type neither begins nor ends with the cabinets that live in the Liefde Rosenblatt Library, our climate-controlled facility known colloquially as our vault, where we keep our duplicate books, rare books, and other items in our collection. The presence of type has long been a component of the visitor's experience to the museum side of the Yiddish Book Center and continues to be so today. It features most prominently in the segment of our core exhibition dealing with Yiddish type, Yiddish press, and Yiddish politics. So at the center of it all, no doubt, is a big, beautiful, mysterious, and terrifying machine, our linotype. Sometimes known as the last Yiddish linotype, though I've been told before by disgruntled and occasionally less than friendly aficionados of hot metal type, there is no such thing as a Yiddish linotype. There is just a linotype machine with a Yiddish keyboard and Yiddish matrices, but maybe that's just a little bit of pedantics. Our number 18 linotype machine, model number 23211, is quite literally center stage as you walk down the aisle, which forms the backbone of our public book repository and exhibition space. You find yourself staring the hulking beast down until you are face to face with it. This machine has been the subject of much myth-making and a fair share of myth-busting. Before we moved into our current space, the linotype was actually functional and put to semi-regular use in our former warehouse site in Holyoke, Massachusetts. Since moving to its current home, it has stood unused, a monument to the scale and scope of the Yiddish press past. But for many years, it stood largely uninterpreted and lent itself to some fairly elaborate stories told by center tour guides over the years, myself included. Thankfully, former Yiddish Book Center bibliography fellow Rafi Half has already busted most of these myths to whatever extent it was possible, and has an excellent article up on the Book Center's website about the true history of our linotype machine. If you're curious, the article is called Adventures of a Bad Researcher. If you put that into our search box on the website, you'll find the article. Highly recommend it. It's a great read. But briefly, to tell first the sort of mythic version and then the true story of the linotype. The way I first heard it is that back in the day, in the late 1980s, the Forverts had about 18 of these linotype machines left in their composing room on 33rd Street in New York City. And now by the late 1980s, most other newspapers would have moved beyond this technology. They would have been using maybe photo offset techniques or even a digital technique by that point. But the Forwards was still using hot metal to produce their daily newspaper. And there's a story that goes that, because the Forwards was a socialist newspaper, their linotype team was, of course, unionized. And members of the union, the guys, the linotype operators, they didn't want to learn the new technology. They didn't want to retire, and the Forwards couldn't well go and fire members of their union, so they had to wait until these guys gave it up in order to give up these machines for good. And when they finally did, they got rid of 17 of the machines, kept one, and replaced the rest of their composing work with one single Macintosh computer. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't exactly know. There are other stories of other papers transitioning from hot metal type to cold type or to digital means where they replaced their type rooms with an equal number of computer terminals as they had typesetting machines. But admittedly, the Forwards at the time was also downsizing and moving from, being a daily paper to a weekly paper. So it's possible they replaced it with one computer. What we do know to be true is that in the end, of the late 1980s, the Forwards had only 9 of these machines remaining. 8 of them were broken up and sold for scrap metal, and one of them was kept for us here at the Yiddish Book Center. At that time, it was sitting in the basement composer room of the Forwards at 33rd Street. And now this is like a 4,000-pound machine. So in order to move this thing, you need a lot of effort. And it was decided that it wasn't worth the effort to try and move it whole. So instead, the machine was taken apart piece by piece and shipped up to Massachusetts, where it was reassembled on site at the Yiddish Book Center by an experienced linotype repairman named Paul Nash. And Aaron told me recently that when Paul was doing this in the early 90s, he did it without any guidebooks, any instructions, nothing whatsoever, all based on his memory and intuition. And so the story goes, the book center staff were sort of hanging over his shoulder at the time, completely baffled as to how he was doing this and totally skeptical that the machine was ever going to work again. But it did. And we actually used to operate this machine on site at the center. Lord knows we don't operate it anymore. I'm sure OSHA would come knocking down our door with all sorts of complaints if we tried to operate a machine that runs on molten lead in a room full of very flammable books. But just to sort of close out the story of the linotype, one of the other myths about the linotype was, of course, this aspect of the union. What we do know is that towards the end of the late 1980s, the Forwards was actually employing non-union labor in their type room. Most of these would have been sort of Haredi or Hasidic, from religious Yiddish speakers, because this was at a time when most of the native secular Yiddish speakers who would have been skilled linotype operators were retiring or passing on. And there wasn't much left in terms of skilled secular linotype operators who knew Yiddish, but there was in the Hasidic world. And these guys, out of their love for the language, came and worked for the Forwards. And there is a story which I haven't been able to confirm yet, but so it goes, that one of these Hasidic operators would set anything that the Forwards gave him to set, even if it was totally secular, totally disagreed with his religious morals, with his politics, whatever. There was only one thing he refused to set, and those were the stories of Isaac Bashevis Singer, who often published in the Forwards, because he thought that Bashevis was far too sexually lewd, and he wanted nothing to do with Bashevis. But nowadays, the linotype is accompanied by a much more robust interpretive apparatus, including both technical elements as well as the social history of the Yiddish press and the role therein of the machine's previous owner, the Forverts, for whom it stands metonymically. On the technical side, the linotype is now accompanied on a wall opposite the machine by a diagram explaining its most important elements, as well as a video demonstrating a linotype in action. We designed this diagram to boil the function of the machine down to its most basic components, and I'll say, having written the copy for it, as a layman, it was quite the challenge to pick out the essential components from a maze of jargon and technical processes that a friendly contemporary linotype operator provided us with. Just a note, so how we boiled it down, basically the linotype is 3 machines in one. It's got what we call an assembly machine, a casting machine, and a distribution machine. You have an operator who sits at a typewriter-like keyboard and they type away, and the assembly machine drops in what are called matrices, which are basically little molds, into a line and forms a line of text, or a linotype, where the name of the machine comes from. The operator then pulls a lever that sends it over to the casting machine, which casts that mold in molten lead, and then shoots out what we call a slug, which is the prepared line of type ready for printing. And then the most brilliant part about the machine is that the machine then picks up these matrices and uses little keys, sawtooth keys at the top of them, to sort them mechanically back into the proper channel in the magazine. So you don't have to sort any of your type by hand when working with a linotype. The machine does it all for you, which is a pretty brilliant invention. So like I said, the accompanying video that goes along with this diagram puts our principles into action and gives the visitors a sense of just how loud and lively this machine is. One can then imagine what it must have been like to be in a room of 10 or more linotypes side by side. It really was the mechanical printing at its industrial peak. Now, I'm going to play a clip here. It's about a minute long. There's a longer version of this video that you'd have to come and visit us at the Yiddish Book Center to see. This features Michael Babcock Jr., who was our linotype expert, who helped us to interpret the linotype and set up the exhibition of the linotype. And he also produced this video for us showing how an actual linotype machine operates. So this is just a 1-minute clip from that video.
When the line was set, you can read it because the reference side of the matrix has the character stamped and highlighted so that you can proof it before you send it into cast. And when the line is ready to go, the operator will handle the plunger drops. The line is cast, out it comes. The second elevator comes down to pick up the mats. And they drop by gravity off of an index bar back into their proper channel. It's like magic. And what comes out is a line of type.
So surrounding the linotype itself actually are 2 rails with explanatory panels, detailing the story of how the machine came to have its home in Amherst, our effort to domesticate the apocryphal stories of the machine's provenance and replace them with the truth. And here we have moved away as much as possible from the linotype as a source of book center mythos and towards the linotype as representative, on the one hand, of the outsized role of the forward in American Jewish life, on the other hand, of the large and complex system of labor that went into producing the Yiddish word. So staring you down as you peruse our linotype is a more than life-size photo of Rebbe Kiva Tzvi Berliner, a native Yiddish speaker from Poland, a Ger Chassid, a Holocaust survivor, and one of the last full-time employees of the Forverts basement composing room. This photo, by the way, comes to us from the great documentarian of New York's labor history, Harvey Wang, whose photos from that era you can see on display now at the Yiddish Book Center. And for anyone local, I highly recommend it. But it is really this labor of type, which in my personal view brings together the various threads of type and print culture which are present in our exhibition, anchored by our linotype display. As you take leave of Reb Berliner and his linotype and move further into this section, you will be introduced to the long and varied history of political activism and ideological apparatuses in Yiddish, from right to left, but especially on the left and with regards to the labor movement. Moving towards the end of this section, you leave behind the explicit focus on politics and return to the labor of typesetting, with a small wall display detailing the history and work of Yiddish typesetters. Bookending this section are 2 archival images, one of the Forwards composing room, and the other of the Yiddish writer Hay Leivik visiting the Buenos Aires Yiddish daily Die Presse, or the Press. And of course, I couldn't get through this talk without reminding you that while America plays a big role, the central theme of our core exhibition is Yiddish as a global culture, and that includes the work of setting Yiddish type. So here, visitors will encounter a transition from the historical to the contemporary, with a cabinet housing contemporary Yiddish serial and informal publications. I want to highlight here the work of Jay Saper, whose covers for their students' zines bring contemporary Yiddish letterpress arts into the realm of informal publishing. And for those who don't know, a zine, otherwise known as a fan magazine, is a sort of small, typically handmade, home-printed, hand-folded pamphlet that is often, contains something like a comic or perhaps a couple poems or a couple of essays. And they're a hallmark of sort of informal publishing scenes, especially sort of underground cultural movements as well. As well, I'd also like to highlight the work of Jacob Rom, who we met earlier, whose bilingual Yiddish-English translation of Menke Katz's poem, Yiddish Kodesh, Holy Yiddish in Jacob's translation, hangs on the wall behind our challenge proof press, which you saw on the previous slide, which also once served in the basement composing room on 33rd Street. So recently, I had the pleasure of presenting on the Book Center's type collection at a conference about Yiddish and Hebrew type in the Twin Cities, where in addition to connecting with scholars and book artists the world over, many of whom were very eager to get to peek into the depths of our collection, I also got to hear both Jay and Jacob speak about their own work, which gave me greater insight both into their work and to contemporary Jewish letterpress arts writ large. So to preface what I'm going to say about their work, having heard them speak, it is useful to know that the Yiddish Book Center's collection, while extensive and wide-ranging, is not complete. Many of our fonts, and remember a font is a specific set of type at a specific weight and size, are missing sorts. They're missing the actual individual letters. In fact, some of them don't even have a complete aleph base. And this is not at all uncommon for vintage and historic Yiddish and Hebrew type. So it's not uncommon then with working with type like this to find yourself, quote unquote, out of sorts. Some people speculate, as an aside, that the idiom to be out of sorts comes from the confusion that typesetters faced when they ran out of type or got all their type mixed up. So you might think that being out of sorts means being unable to work, but this has not historically meant the impossibility of printing in Yiddish, such as can be seen in this book, Die letzte Tag von Warschauer Ghetto, or The Last Days of the Warsaw Ghetto, by the survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, Rachmiel Grinspan, which was published in the US administered zone in Germany in 1947 and is on display as part of Yiddish global culture. At the time, not having had access to sufficient Yiddish type, the title and content of the book were set in Latin type using Polish transliteration of Yiddish. But this, of course, does not make it any less of a Yiddish book. And in a way, Jay Saper's work is drawing on this history of persistence and resistance, such as the piece you can see here, created during the 2020 uprisings against police violence and anti-Black racism, which, despite Jay's lack of access to suitable Yiddish type at the time, brings the history of Yiddish anti-police activism into conversation with contemporary abolition work. Finding oneself out of sorts can also lead to creative solutions, as Jacob Brom shows with his Menke Katz broadside. Lacking a full aleph base in many of our most decorative typefaces, Jacob employed two distinct typefaces to set the title of the poem Yiddish Kodesh. Turning a limitation into an opportunity, he is subtly reminding us here of Yiddish's hybrid origins. Yiddish, as a name for the language, as well as simply meaning Jewish, comes from the Germanic roots of the language, whereas Kodesh, of course, comes from Hebraic roots. So in employing two distinct typefaces, Jacob has effectively put into print what scholars call the, quote, component consciousness of Yiddish. That is, the general awareness on the part of Yiddish speakers of the etymological roots of individual words. So beyond these creative responses to the limitations of working with physical type, the idea that most connected Jacob and Jay's talks and their work, as well as I would argue the work we do here at the Yiddish Book Center, is the idea of Yiddish type as a means of connecting to the past and bringing that past into the future. Yiddish scholars often like to speak about a, quote, usable past. That is, representations of our history which serve the political and cultural needs of our present. Yiddish culture, as you can imagine, is a goldmine for these usable pasts. And through the work of print artists like Jacob and Jay, we see this concept become literalized, physically putting the past, vintage Yiddish type, to work in order to serve our cultural future. Both artists speak about this and about their work, bringing tradition into conversation with contemporary life and deploying what might feel like an obsolete technology to build new culture and create new worlds. So to conclude on a personal note, this is, I suppose, what drew me to our type collection. It's the same thing that drew me to the Yiddish language and Yiddish culture in the first place. There is, perhaps, a hopeless romanticism to both, an attachment to a culture and an artistic practice that is in some ways past its prime, or at least has seen better days. A practice that will always be outside the mainstream, will always require a bit more effort and attention. And I say this all, I have to say, very, very fully aware that these sorts of thoughts are verboten in the Yiddish world. There are many who would scoff at this sort of assertion, and I have to include myself in that category most days. But here, working with the type, I think there is a beauty to what is old and out of time, and there is certainly always something to be learned for it. So I too have taken, as you can see, to the lead and the ink, and on screen is one of my first efforts at printing with the Yiddish Book Center's type. It says Habucher Hazetzer Shmuel Sher. Habucher Hazetzer, literally a young man typesetter. Shmuel Sher, my name in Yiddish. And I have read that the term Habucher Hazetzer is a term that experienced typesetters would use to refer to junior employees in a Yiddish type shop. But according to the Yiddish writer Besiod Bialystotsky, it is in fact an honorific. In his contribution to the Festschrift of Meir Kastoff, the legendary Yiddish printer and one-time president of the Hebrew-American Typographical Union, Bialystotsky writes that very few printers truly earn the title Habucher Hazetzer. So whether I am being humble or totally presumptuous, I don't actually know. I only know that I am working in a long tradition of Bechorim, many of whom have harbored similarly romantic sentiments about their work. So be it hopeless romanticism or cultural renaissance, a usable past or an unusable past, there is no doubt that the role of letterpress type, both in our collection and in the printing world writ large, much like the role of the Yiddish language in secular communities, has shifted dramatically in the last century. On the one hand, I think I've narrated here a transition from the industrial to the artisanal, from the bustling composing room of the Forverts headquarters to the stillness of the book center's vault. But on the other hand, I have also made an effort to tell a story of continuity. The work of Yiddish typesetting continues. The Yiddish word lives on not only in the ephemeral digital space, but materially in ink and on paper. And so to return to the exhibition, at the end of it all, at the very bottom of our cabinet housing contemporary Yiddish publications, visitors will encounter a drawer with a sample of our wooden display type. This drawer, I like to think, is an invitation. And here I'm going to paraphrase Bialystotsky from the same essay I cited above. It's an invitation to place a letter after a letter, a syllable after a syllable, a word after a word, and so to give birth to a line, a poem, an essay, or a novel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Caleb. Really, it's so wonderful, and the work you're doing is one that I'm particularly keen on. So thanks. Let's start with a bunch of questions. Can you first please repeat the name of the article on the linotype machine?
Of course, absolutely. The article is called Adventures of a Bad Researcher, and the author is the former Yiddish Book Center fellow, Rafi Helf. He's now a PhD student at Harvard University. Lovely guy, met him recently at this conference, and his work on the history of the linotype has been absolutely essential in my work getting to know our type collection.
You share an infectious enthusiasm, the two of you. I also will mention that I'm in the middle of a really nasty storm outside, so if you lose me, I apologize. Can you recommend any sources of Yiddish computer fonts?
That's a good question. Truthfully, no. Most of the fonts that you would use for using Yiddish on a computer are pretty much just repurposed Hebrew fonts. And one of the funny things that I'll say about this is that what's something I didn't realize until I attended this conference a couple months ago is that Hebrew type designers and Hebrew book designers have a huge chip on their shoulders about the fact that there is not enough usable typefaces for Hebrew and by extension for Yiddish as well. And so they're all go around being grumpy all day about how there isn't enough type out there. And a lot of them are actually engaged in some really fascinating and exciting work to develop new Hebrew typefaces.
Please, please, please. We have that challenge in the work we do. Because Yiddish is written right to left, do the linotype machine have to be a mirror image of other such machines?
Yes, that is a good point. So I don't know all of the technical details on this front, but someone explained it to me once that it's not that you have to rebuild the whole machine backwards. Most of the components of the machine are still the same, but there is a certain mechanism within the assembly part of the machine that you just sort of reverse and put in the other direction in order that it sets the type in the proper direction. So there is a distinction on that front between a Yiddish language linotype and an English language linotype, but it's not like you're rebuilding sort of a mirror image of the whole machine in order to get that.
Caleb, I took one of your public tours. Really wonderful. Thank you for that and for tonight's presentation. Can you tell me how old some of the type is, and do you organize the collection because we didn't see it on the tour?
Yes, those are great questions. So a question of age, I can't really give you specifics. I mean, so for example, the stuff that's called the Packenträger type that comes to us from Jim Kaplan, I know that type was first cast, so first designed and first cast in metal in the 1930s, so it can't be older than that. But it's probably much later than that because Einspruch was translating his book in about his book being the New Testament in the 1950s, or was it earlier? In the 1940s, I believe, was the first translation. And he had that set of type cast for him in order to be able to actually set the book. So it's probably about the 1940s for that. Some of the wood type might be quite a bit older. One of the things I recently learned is that wood type, surprisingly, is actually a lot more durable than metal type, because metal type is made of lead. Lead is a very soft metal. It falls apart very easily. And, the letter forms wear down and it's kind of unusable after that, but wood holds up a little bit more over the years, actually. So I recently visited a type shop in Toronto where the master printer there showed me some wood type they had that was like over 150 years old. So I don't think any of our type is that old, but I would say most of it, you're probably looking on the order of 6 or 7 decades to about 100 years old.
And we've got a question that doesn't relate exactly, but it's also in your realm, a project that you've been involved with. Can you say something about the Yiddish and Hebrew typewriters that are in the Yiddish Book Center on display in the collection?
Sure. I mean, I don't know what there is to say much beyond that they're just the most beautiful things. And if you get the chance to visit the center, it's like probably could spend hours just staring at them. I'll say, so, similarly, our typewriters cover a sort of similar temporal range to our type. Our oldest comes from 1917, and our most recent is as late as 1983 or something like that. And interestingly, just like I showed earlier, that we have a sort of mix of Yiddish and Hebrew type, sort of Yiddish specific and Hebrew specific type in our collection. We also have a mix of Hebrew and Yiddish typewriters. Because again, using the same Aleph base, you can use one sort of interchangeably to do both languages.
Do you know if there are any biographies of any of the type designers?
The type designers, yes. I don't know about full biographies, but there's a lot of work recently that I learned about at this conference, especially into some of the more famous Hebrew type designers, especially. And I think most of the Yiddish typefaces, at least the ones that I've encountered, are sort of derived from things that would have been used for printing Hebrew Sforim first, so Hebrew holy books. I have yet to encounter anything that was designed purposefully as a Yiddish typeface, maybe with the exception of the Packenträger. But so some of the big names, like I'm forgetting his first name, but Narkis is one of the big Hebrew typesetters. There's a recent scholarly interest in a woman named Franziska Baruch, who was one of the few female type designers who designed a lot of very notable and famous typefaces in Hebrew. So there is some scholarly work. I don't know that anyone has gone so far as to publish a sort of public, more public-oriented biography of these people yet.
Great presentation. Will you share a recording or slides of this event? Yes, we will. It will be on yiddishbookcenter.org in about a week or so in the public program recordings section. Thank you. And as you pointed out, Caleb, if folks come to the center, they can see all of this live, including the wonderful video. The other question, what do you hope to do with this collection? Is anyone still using it?
That's a fantastic question. So I'll put a very, very big and important caveat in front of this, which is that I make no promises. One of my goals would be to start using this type again. We have a ways to go before we can do that. We don't have a functional press at the center at the moment, which is a big hindrance. And also a lot of our type needs a bit of love and attention. It needs some cleaning and it needs some more organizational work before I would be comfortable letting someone in who doesn't really know what they're doing to handle it. But people have worked with it in recent years. Like, for example, I mentioned Jacob Rom, the Yiddish letterpress artist who was one of our translation fellows about 2 years ago now. And when he was here as a translation fellow, he got to see all of the type and he fell in love with it. He was already a letterpress artist at that time and asked permission if he could use our type. And we said yes. And he also very kindly produced these beautiful specimens for us as part of this project. And so we're hoping to be able to invite more people like Jacob in to use our type. And I'll say another thing that Lisa and I have talked about a bunch is producing some proofs of some of this type so that we can use it as the basis for digitizing these typefaces as well, which could be another exciting project. So the answer is there's lots that could be done with it. There's work to be done before we can do these things, though.
Someone is wondering if the presentations from the conference you attended are available online.
No, unfortunately not. They're not available publicly.
I'm going to end with this question, which also is going to allow me to make a little announcement for our viewers. Thank you so much for the invaluable work. It would seem that Yiddish typesetting is having a bit of a moment currently. Why do you think that might be?
Oof, that's the question of the moment, isn't it? I suppose it's kind of related to the similar question of why Yiddish is having a moment, or at least everyone says Yiddish is having a moment right now. I mean, I don't know that I have a really thoughtful answer on this, other than to say that it's just cool. It's cool and it's fun to work with. And as there are more and more people getting back into the Yiddish world, there's more and more people with the knowledge, the requisite knowledge to work with this stuff. And then you combine that with the fact that these sorts of practices, these sorts of, more now artisanal practices, are just undergoing a general renaissance. I mean, you can think of another example is the recent surge of interest in film photography. It's a similar sort of love affair and interest with everything that is old and slow, and forces you to take your time and think very carefully about your aesthetic practice. And so I think it's sort of a merger of those two worlds.
And for all of you out there in our audience who are members of the Yiddish Book Center, you do receive your subscription of Pockenträger. And Caleb, we are hard at work on the next issue, which will be devoted to Yiddish type. It should be really fun. You're working on that with co-editor David Mazauer, who you work with as our bibliographer. So there's a lot of energy behind the next issue. If you are not a member, join, support our work, and you will get your subscription to Pockenträger. So you can learn more about that on the center's website. Caleb, I want to thank you so much for the presentation and for all the work that you do and all that you bring to your work. It's really exciting and a pleasure to work with you, and look forward to seeing what becomes of all of this. So thank you again. Thank you. I want to thank our producer this evening, Elizabeth Carteropoli, who always manages behind the scenes and is standing by if I get a lightning strike. Thank you. Please consider joining us if you're in the neighborhood. At the Yiddish Book Center this coming Sunday, June 23rd at 2 p.m. We'll be screening Nathanism. And if you arrive early, plan to take our free public tour of the new core exhibition, Yiddish: A Global Culture. To learn more about our events, yiddishbookcenter.org/events. To plan your visit, yiddishbookcenter.org/visit. And please do consider visiting us this summer. We've got lots planned, live events as well. To register for any of our programs and to see the full calendar of events, yiddishbookcenter.org/events. I want to take a moment before we leave to thank all of you out there who are our members. Your membership helps our ongoing work. If you are not a member, please consider joining and supporting the work. And you can learn more about how you can support our work at yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Look forward to welcoming you back into the theater and hopefully to the center for a visit. Thanks for joining us tonight. Be safe, be well, and see you soon.